The weary man wobbled back up the stairs and stood beside the bookshelf filled with stories. He looked at the ladder, wanting to lay out under the stars, but he knew that the lighthouse would be too bright now. So he shuffled against the wall between the bookcase and the desk, and he sat on the cool ground. Blue wrapped his hands around his knees, laying his head back against the stone, and then the tired man slept. Wrinkling, scurrying, sunlight. Blue cracked his eye open in the middle of a sunbeam. The morning light spilled onto the colorful journals that sat beside the sprawled-out man. He opened his mouth to yawn, turning his head slightly to the right. A rat stared back at him, its beady black eyes curious at the unusual guest. Blue closed his mouth and sat up, rubbing his eyes. "I must be sleeping in your spot," he said aloud. The rat stared up at the man, wrinkling its nose. The man stared back, scratching his unshaven beard. Then, without even saying goodbye, the rat scurried away. Blue squinted as he looked through the bright square of light on the other side of the room. The space felt different in the sunlight, its hidden corners exposed. There were new eccentricities for Blue to behold. Glistening cobwebs stretched from the ceiling to the floor. A dirty rug lay rolled up in the corner. Blue looked up at the ceiling and noticed with pleasant surprise that it had been painted. Some traveler from another time had left their mark, a vibrant splash of yellow and blue to match the sky at dawn. They'd painted the sun, a large circle in the center with golden beams radiating out. Some of the plaster had fallen to the ground, and there were sections that had been damaged over time, but Blue could imagine what the original might have looked like. He smiled as he stood, eager to open the hatch and let the light in. Once he had, he sat atop the desk in the freshly aired room and looked into a small hand mirror that he had found in a dusty corner. Blue looked at the eyes staring back at him and felt a strange sense of déjà vu. The longer he looked, the more energized and pliable the air felt, as if he could reach out and touch the atoms vibrating invisibly in front of him. Blue wondered about the stranger looking back at him. Setting the mirror aside, he eyed the staircase, eager to make his way down. As he made his descent, the darkness overtook the light from upstairs, painting the rounded walls with twisted shadows. He wondered, covering his nose with his fist, if being able to see now made the smell even worse. This time, Blue reached the bottom without tripping over the floor. When he did, he stopped and stared at the grotesquely decayed human corpse that lay propped against the barricaded door. Blue promptly turned and vomited onto the dusty floor. He hadn't noticed the body on his way down. It lay jumbled to the side, a lumpy mound of stained and discolored cloth. Only when he had gotten close did he see the sunken eye sockets and the yellowed bones. Bits of matted hair still clung to parts of the skull. The right leg lay crumpled at an odd and uncomfortable angle. Blue looked at the corpse again and dry heaved in the moist, warm air. The body was strangely small, almost like a child, but the bones looked stumpy and old. Without thinking, Blue made his way for the door and began throwing aside everything that barricaded it. Another small bookshelf, 2 wooden chairs, a bench. He threw everything aside, desperate to get to the door handle and the clean air on the other side. The body, which had been slumped against one of the chairs, slid to the ground with a thud as Blue moved about, its arm brushing against his calf. Finding the handle, he yanked on it, pulling with so much force that the door flew from its hinges and onto the cluttered floor inside. Light spilled into the musty room that hadn't seen the sun in years, decades. Blue practically jumped out onto the sand and rocks, letting the cool ocean air fill his lungs. He stood there, hands on his knees and breathing hard. He'd just woken up and already he was exhausted. Once he'd composed himself, he looked back, frowning at the lighthouse. Now he understood why the door had been so difficult to push open the night before. Blue stood, sinking into the sand and letting the sun warm his shoulders, chest, and back. He stretched his legs and arms, feeling his body slowly catch up to his mind. Shuddering, he wondered why the unfortunate person had decided to barricade themselves inside of the lighthouse. Why wouldn't they have left? What could have been so dangerous or frightening for them to perish in such a way? Blue looked out at the black, brackish water and at the city that gleamed like a sword on the horizon. The sun rose slowly in the sky as the minutes ticked by. Later in the morning, Blue found himself walking along the shore a ways away from the lighthouse. He'd gone to the river for drinking water and had walked alongside it, following its curve until deciding to go for a swim. As he waded in the shallows, he thought of the lighthouse and the possibility of it becoming his shelter. It had been abandoned, but not in the way he'd hoped. He wondered if the place was safe. With the thick forest at its back and the deep ocean at its front, the lighthouse was like some strange outpost, hovering between vast, hidden realms of the world. It felt as if he was at the center of everything here. The story of the world unfolding in the blooming of the flowers, the crashing of the waves, and the streaking of the white-gray sky. Blue closed his eyes and dipped his head underneath the waves. He floated there, gently rocking with the river's current, his hair floating up and around like thick spider's silk. Sunlight dappled his cheeks as he spun across the surface of the water. Swimming underneath the waves, Blue made the decision to make the lighthouse his own. He'd remain here for the time being, camping out until he could find a way to the city. Content with his decision, Blue opened his eyes, inviting the underwater world into focus. He reflexively gasped, eyes wide, taking in a mouthful of water. Blue burst through the surface, coughing and gagging, looking wildly around him. He spun his head from left to right, trying to make sense of what he'd just seen. Nothing there. He turned back in the direction he'd been facing and plunged once more beneath the waves. Blue opened his eyes and scanned the murky waters. There, off in the distance, through the seaweed and sand, was a light emanating from the depths of the riverbed. That was what he'd been looking for. The same light he'd seen in the ocean last night was now closer, deep in the river. Blue returned to the surface, now sure of what he'd seen. He was still relatively close to the shore, the water only reaching up to his shoulders. The light was far off though, probably 400 meters out, and there was a steep drop-off just 100 feet ahead of Blue. Getting to the light would be difficult, if not impossible, without a boat. He wondered how he would get there. Blue returned to the shore, intrigued by the mysterious golden light. He dried himself in the sun for a time, looking out at the calm waves before grabbing his shirt and pants from a nearby branch and heading back to the lighthouse. In the afternoon light, the lighthouse took on an almost majestic quality. The high ceiling and curved white walls appealed to the romantic in Blue, making it easy for him to see the room's potential. He had cleared out the rubbish and brushed the floors clean with some large leaves that he'd found. The room now stood empty aside from a small can of fresh blue hydrangeas on the bookshelf. The doorway stood open to the afternoon breeze and the light that cascaded in. Blue hadn't been able to reattach the door. The hinges were too rusted. Instead, he would prop it up against the outer wall and slide it closed whenever he felt the need to. It would still do its job in keeping out the elements. He wondered if it would keep out unwanted guests. Blue worried, looking over at the body that he'd gently removed from the lighthouse. It now lay atop a pile of leaves that he'd found. The body hadn't had anything much of value on it, only the clothes on its back and a pocket knife, which Blue took gratefully. He thought the man deserved a proper burial, whoever he was. Blue thought of him dying there, alone and afraid. He walked over and carefully wrapped the leaves around the shrunken remains, careful not to damage them. Hefting the body over his shoulder, he carried it to the edge of the forest before placing it into a small grave that he dug into the sand and dirt. Blue spent the afternoon burying the body and finding a proper headstone to mark it. Afterwards, he said his brief goodbye and set about taking care of his rumbling stomach. Blue had gathered nuts and berries from the forest earlier that day, and he wondered if he might try his luck at fishing. The sky was cloudy and the day was fading quickly. There was still so much to do, he thought. As Blue made his way to the river, he thought of the road that he'd seen yesterday. He had chosen to go one way because he'd spotted the lighthouse, but he wondered what was down the other way. Roses and the smell of something sweet flirted with Blue's memory. He shuddered, feeling a sickness in his gut, forcing himself to focus on fishing. Blue had brought along a rusty metal pail that he'd found, just in case he caught too many fish to carry back. In his other hand, he carried a long, sharpened stick. He couldn't remember if he'd ever fished before losing his memory, but he knew what it looked like. He walked up to the water's edge, placing the bucket on the smooth, gray rocks lining the shore. The flow of water had, over time, nearly polished the surface of the stones. The naked man squinted his eyes and looked across the surface of the water, eager for his first catch.